Gary Nixon of Baltimore wins, setting a lap average record of over 98 miles an hour. The prize, $5,000. Over 4,000 anti-hate people jammed Detroit's Belle Isle Park in another example of the recent social phenomenon that's sweeping the country. It's a giant love-in, close relative to the be-in, sort of a happy happening laced with the rites of spring. The slogans were just...
Do you reject, for instance, monogamy? Do you reject the notion of sexual continence before marriage?
What's been called a new morality, and I really think that's what the American, this thing called the American sexual revolution is really all about. It's an attempt to replace the old legalism. It's certainly not a rejection of monogamy as such, but very much an attempt, in the case of premarital sex, there really hasn't been any moral code in the past except simply a thou shalt not.
What is called the sexual revolution was a social movement in the 1960s and 70s that opposed traditional values relating to sexual beliefs. Thousands of years of what a marriage was were evidently thrown out, and put into place was an idol of lust instead. No longer were men and women expected to wait till marriage, but in fact the opposite became the reality. A whole host of other beliefs were as well preached by this revolution. For example, abortion, contraception, adult films, etc. Now, to some, this may sound like a good thing. Some might say that this actually liberates human beings from the shackles of tradition. But in reality, this idea of liberation is merely a cop-out for the moral atrocities that this movement would go on to influence, not only in the United States, but almost the whole world. Let us begin with marriage and see the current state which it is in after the so-called sexual revolution. A recent Pew Research study found that public views of the family are complicated. Americans are more pessimistic than optimistic about the institution of marriage and the family. Another study writes, globally, the divorce rate has more than doubled from 1970 until 2008. According to the experts, over half of all marriages ends in divorce or separation in the United States. These are scary statistics, and interestingly, the divorce rates have doubled from 1970 to 2008. Of course, 1970 was around the time when the sexual revolution was taking effect. This is evidently different to before the sexual revolution. Now, some might object that this is the case, since divorce was much harder to get at the time. Now, while this is true, we must keep in mind that by far the majority of the population of US citizens, for example, were Christian, and divorce was something shunned upon almost by all. As later, a new outlook was put into place by the sexual revolution in the 1970s and 80s. Nowadays, marriage is almost no different to dating. People get married, divorced, get remarried, and divorced again. In fact, one of the leading reasons for divorce is infidelity or extramarital affairs. This is the result of idolizing sexual activities in a marriage or relationship, since once you get bored, they either have an affair or divorce and move on to somebody else. And this modern notion of a marriage is truly an atrocity on society and the world. For example, results find that divorced individuals, compared to their married counterparts, have higher levels of psychological distress, substance abuse, and depression, as well as lower levels of overall health. And most especially when it comes to marriages in which the parents have kids, divorce obviously severely affects the children. One study finds, our analyses showed that depressed adolescents with separated parents had an excess risk of reoccurrence of depression in adulthood, compared with depressed adolescents with non-separated parents. In addition, among adolescents with depression, parental separation was associated with an increased risk of a switch to bipolar disorder in adulthood. So not only is divorce on the mainstream level disastrous for the parents, but especially young children. As a side note, if you want to help support me, consider buying my new released merchandise, which is based on St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. Thank you for any support. We move to yet again another issue, abortion. Since the decision of Roe v. Wade in 1973, over 63 million babies have been murdered. Not only is this a moral evil, but it truly is an atrocity. and it clearly has affected the parents who go through with this procedure. In fact, one study found that the occurrence of post-abortion depression has been observed to be widespread globally. It clearly is not an easy thing to get an abortion, and this, in some sense, shows the reality that the fetus inside the mother is more than just a clump of cells. It is truly human life.
I think our demands are saying that moral codes and theological issues have no business in the law books.
In fact, the arguments for abortion most of the time assume that the fetus is not human, and their reasoning tends to be all over the place. Some might say that the fetus becomes human at a certain trimester in pregnancy, others think it's consciousness that determines its humanity, and others even go as far as saying that it's when the baby is born that it has value. Of course, though, these are arbitrary classifications, which have no basis in reality. In fact, many of these arguments are self-refuting or reductio ad absurdum. For example, if consciousness defines that a person is human or has value, then does a boxer who gets knocked out and loses consciousness then therefore lose his value? Of course not. Not to get too deep into philosophy, but the sort of question of when and what constitutes a human life is metaphysical or philosophical. For human is nothing more than a rational animal, which is its metaphysical nature. You might think that this excludes babies in the womb, for they, as you say, or suppose, are not rational. But it is not the matter of what they are made up of that constitutes their rationality per se. For all men are endowed with a rational soul, and this is known not only through sacred scripture, but also through philosophical or metaphysical means. But lest we dwell too deep into philosophy, we shall proceed forth. We move then to our last issue that the sexual revolution has brought forth: adult films or pornography in the idolization of sex. The negative effects of adult films is especially seen with regard to younger audiences, many of whom are under the age of 18. This industry of adult films has brought forth unrealistic expectations of what a relationship is. It has made men think that women are merely tools or means for pleasure. One study writes, "The growing consumption of internet pornography, mainly in male population, becomes an increasing problem, which is closely linked to compulsive sexual behavior. Users of online pornography involved in these activities also reported that their self-exposition to pornographic material may create guilty feelings and internal conflict in themselves with respect to their own involuntary sexual behavior." And this idea of nudity, sex, and adult entertainment has leaked its way into TV shows, movies, and even music. We know that adult films have disastrous consequences for the youth, and now think about the uphill battle that they have, where everywhere they turn, a lustful temptation is thrown at them. As well, building upon what was said before, pornography also affects adults and their relationships with others. Pornography can have negative consequences for both the user and his or her intimate partner. So the most common damaging effects of pornography for users can include addiction, isolation, increased aggression, distorted beliefs and perceptions about relationships and sexuality, negative feelings about themselves, and neglecting other areas of their lives. And further, as the psychiatrist Dr. Norman Doidge writes, pornographers promise healthy pleasure and relief from sexual tension, but what they often deliver is an addiction, tolerance, and eventual decrease in pleasure. Paradoxically, the male patients I worked with often craved pornography, but didn't like it. Pornography, though many are scared to admit, is clearly an evil drug and needs to be banned from society. The sexual revolution was and is a monster, and secretly has caused moral atrocities right under our noses. No longer is sex a sacred act as a part of marriage, but it has become merely a dopamine boost, in which all you need is contraceptives to avoid pregnancy. Most importantly, one of the major issues that the sexual revolution proposed was women's value in society. But clearly they knew nothing, since women have been treated as objects now in entertainment, films, colleges, and any place else you can think of. In fact, one professor of psychology wrote, Plenty of studies have shown a link between porn use and sexual violence. In particular, men who act aggressively towards women are typically also heavy porn users. Why is it the case that once casual sex and pornography have been let loose to the public, that sexual violence against women increases? Should we be surprised that once you throw out the sacredness of sex and its purpose in marriage, that it's completely misused? Interestingly, much of this was already predicted by Pope Paul VI in 1968 in his encyclical letter titled Humanae Vitae. In this letter, Paul VI exposed the realities which will occur once we throw out the sacredness and true purpose of sex and instead use it as a tool for pleasure. For example, Paul VI writes, "Responsible men can become more deeply convinced of the truth of the doctrine laid down by the Church on this issue if they reflect on the consequences of methods and plans for artificial birth control. Let them first consider how easily this course of action could open wide the way for marital infidelity and a general lowering of moral standards. Not much experience is needed to be fully aware of human weakness and understand that human beings, and especially the young, who are so exposed to temptation, need incentives to keep the moral law, and it is an evil thing to make it easy for them to break that law. Another effect that gives cause for alarm is that a man who grows accustomed to the use of contraceptive methods may forget the reverence due to a woman, and disregarding her physical and emotional equilibrium, reduce her to being a mere instrument for the satisfaction of his own desires, no longer considering her as his partner whom he should surround with care and affection." Pope Paul VI knew what would happen if we gave many this freedom, and he clearly was right. Unfortunately, even many who would call themselves conservative or some denomination of Christian are scared to call out the abuses which come from contraceptives, abortion, and pornography. This, therefore, is not an issue of freedom, but an issue of moral truth. How many generations need to be destroyed and ruined before we stop this moral atrocity, which is the sexual revolution? What then are we to do? I say that we should uphold marriage as sacred and the marital act as always open to life, and disregard abortion, which is murder, and contraceptives, which turn your partner into an object and destroy the purpose of reproduction that we are instilled with as human beings. We must understand that we have value, not as objects of pleasure, but as men and women created in God's image. With the rationality to which we've been endowed, I say we throw out the concupiscence and vain passions of the flesh, which come with pornography, and fight against this disease which has inflicted humanity. There is always hope to return to the true system of morality that we once had, and it begins with each and every individual person. It begins with me, and God willing, it begins with you. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help support the channel, consider becoming a channel member. As always, God bless.